I will rename it later. Why is that there? Yes, I know. Please go away. Yeah, I'm gonna trip on this. No. Yeah, no lab tomorrow. So you did one, and then it'll be a week off next week.
So do the due dates for mini labs also shift?
I have to look at because I shifted one around, so I'll have to shift them. But yes,
Okay.
I will 100% shift it, so it won't be due next Sunday, but the Sunday after. So yeah, no worries. All right, I guess we should get going here. See how much we can accomplish today. So, dim the lights. Make sure everyone gets nice and sleepy. All right. Okay. So, for today, we're going to at least start off talking about research ethics, what the ethics process kind of looks like. And then, when it comes to, so I guess I'll say before, no lab tomorrow, right? So there's no lab tomorrow. You had a lab last week. No lab tomorrow, but then the following week you will. And if, I think I forgot to shift around a due date when I moved some stuff off my original schedule. So whatever the second mini lab is will be due not this coming Sunday, but the Sunday after that. And I will be working tomorrow and hopefully Thursday on marking your mini labs and getting you feedback on the first one. And if everything goes well, which it never does, I should be able to keep pace with the mini labs, so you're getting feedback and can sort of develop the whole project. And just a reminder, the idea behind the mini labs is that you build towards the major lab. So like if you get a research question and I say, it's good, it could use this tweak, you don't have to create a new research question for the major lab, right? You can keep using those same materials and just add on to them or improve them as I give you feedback. So sometimes people don't realize that, but yeah, you're hopefully building towards that longer assignment as you're doing the mini labs and not reinventing the wheel every step of the way, right? Some people end up doing it because sometimes you end up going down a blind alley and you realize your research question just did not work. Hopefully not too close to the major lab due date, but it does happen. Don't feel like you have to stick with it if you feel like it's not working, but you can stick with it and just keep building towards the major lab. So any questions before I jump into material for today? Anything anyone wants to talk about? No? All right. Let's do it. All righty. So research ethics, right? So research ethics, basically you need research ethics in any kind of sociological research that involves people. Right? So anytime that you are going to be dealing with real people in the real world, no matter how removed you are from them, right? So it might seem like, you're doing a survey and you're using an online survey platform to do it. You're not actually going to be interacting with human beings. But regardless of, I was going to say bless you, but I did that last semester, and then someone was watching live online, and I scared them because they sneezed at the same time, and they were like, "Are you psychic?" So, like, should I say? It could freak out someone at home. It was funny. Yeah. So anytime, right? Like, regardless of your remove, regardless of whether you think you're going to be in direct contact, if it involves human beings in your research, you absolutely need research ethics. Now, of course, you don't need research ethics if you're doing something that doesn't involve people, right? So let's say you're going to go to the census, right? So you're going to download a bunch of the data from either, like, say, the General Social Survey in the US or the census here in Canada. They've already done the work with people. You're just taking the data. In that case, you don't need any ethics, or if you're doing content analysis or something like that. But the second it involves a human being, doesn't matter the remove, you need a research ethics. You need research ethics, right? Okay, so ethics has to be addressed basically at the initial stages of a study, right? It's not something that you can, go back and do after you've already talked to people. So, if you're gonna, let's say an example, right? Your initial plan was you were going to do like a general observation from a distance, right? A complete observer in a public place, which theoretically you wouldn't need research ethics to do. But you end up, meeting someone and someone asks you what you're doing, and you suddenly think, I should interview this person. You can't unless you have research ethics, right? You could take their information and contact them later, but you couldn't just do the research, like the interview, and then be like, oh, I'll get research ethics later. You can't do that because there's a bunch of steps you have to do. Now, that said, ethics, so you do it at the initial stages, generally before you start a project, right? You put together an ethics proposal, which you then send to the research ethics board, and they either approve it or deny it, or sometimes ask you to make some changes, at which point you do that. But ethics also needs to be kept in mind at every phase of the study. It's not like a one and done, right? I thought about it at the beginning, and then you can sort of do whatever you want. Research ethics is important, and sometimes as projects develop, right, before, let's say you decide at a certain point, you want to expand your project or expand the number of interviews you want to do or something like that, you may need to go back and get research ethics to update your ethics, right? To give you more permissions or, anything that you want to change. You have to keep this in mind at every stage of the project and as you're interacting with people, right? And the goal is, of course, the first priority, do no harm, right? Ensure that that your participants aren't harmed by the research that you're doing. Okay, yeah. Now, this comes from a long history of academic research that obviously didn't take into account harm done to participants, right? And in sociology, obviously we have less of a checkered history, though there are some examples that are bad. But things like, in medicine especially, and medicine here is required to do the same kind of things with research ethics that we are, right? Informed consent and all this stuff we'll talk about. But things like, the very famous, the Tuskegee syphilis study, right, is a medical example. And one of the reasons why, we're all really tightly bound to research ethics today. So famously, the Tuskegee syphilis study, basically the US Department of Health wanted to understand better the long-term effects of someone having syphilis. So they found, black men who had contracted syphilis, and they basically told them that they were going to treat them and then gave them a placebo and then kept visiting them back over and over again to see how the disease progressed, right? Because they wanted to know what are the long-term effects of syphilis. And strangely enough, right, you would think that someone at some point would have caught on to the lack of ethics in this, but it actually took decades where basically they went through phases of this before anyone stopped to say, telling people that you're going to treat them for syphilis and then not doing so, kind of unethical at the end of the day, and you're harming your participants by lying to them, and they're not going to seek treatment for syphilis because they think you've already treated them, right? So that and a bunch of other, examples have led to, people now requiring us to do research ethics. Yeah, please.
That begs the question: who exactly are the people part of the ethics committee?
So the ethics.
How do they get their credentials to be like the arbiter of ethics?
So the ethics committees, they're all a little bit different, but they're generally made up of people from, like stakeholders. So typically at the university, it's academics, right? Typically tenured academics. and they tried to draw them from different fields, right? So like in sociology, when I was getting my research ethics, one of the members was a nurse, right? A professor of nursing. And I can't remember the makeup, but there's 3 people on the research ethics board. And basically one of them has to be outside of the specialization. And it's basically, they're supposed to be at arm's length, right? So that they have no stake in your study, right? They have no stake in your success. A sociologist, like someone from the department here, could not be on my research ethics committee because it could be like maybe my supervisor is trying to influence them to get something passed. So generally it has to be arm's length, right? And someone on the research ethics boards has to be a non-specialist. So someone who's totally from a different field. It's not perfect, right? But basically it's like fresh set of eyes, people that are separate from the project, so they have no connection to it or connection to the person. And therefore they should, at least in theory, after going through the ethics training that the university gives, be able to make a decision as to, whether people could be harmed.
Yeah, do they take into account like people like minorities and people like minorities and other people within the ethics community? Because it's kind of like it would be a bit like it would be a bit of a faux pas, like the ethics community bit of like all straight white men. It'd be, even if they are from different communities, it would be a bit
That's generally, especially when you're dealing with people like research that covers people of color, indigenous people, there typically will be a representative of those communities on the ethics board. One of the problems is that it also is a volunteer, right? So as part of your service to the university here, and obviously private industry is a totally different can of worms. Part of your service, you volunteer to be part of research ethics. So it is a little bit bound to who chooses to volunteer as well. But they try to, mix it up. For certainly gender, they want a male-female mix and as much diversity as possible. Again, it depends who's available though, right? Because it's not always an unlimited supply of people. And they can't conscript people into research ethics. They're always looking for people to take part in it who are experts in their field, but are also volunteering their time, right? So yeah, nothing's perfect, but yeah, typically they're trying to get as much diversity of perspectives as possible, especially out of field is the big one, but then obviously different perspectives as well. And again, you often don't know who's on your research ethics board because it's also supposed to be a relatively blind process, right? I just happen to know mine was from nursing they said, this is different from how we do it in nursing was one of the comments that was in the feedback I got on my ethics. But it's supposed to be a blind process as well. So if someone turns you down, you can't go stomping across campus, hunt them down, and threaten them until they release your project from ethics. So.
Is there like a voting process, like there are 9 people, and then like if you get 5 votes,
It has to be unanimous. Yeah, one person on the research ethics board who doesn't agree can shut down the whole process. So it's not like a majority rule. It's like 3 people think this research is perfectly ethical, 2 people think it's unethical, therefore the majority would. No, everybody on the research ethics board has to unanimously agree. And there's been lots of cases where one person can hang you up for a long time, right? Where they're going to be like, yeah, I don't think this is good enough, I'm going to send it back. I don't think this is good enough, I'm going to send it back. And what's that? I guess. Yeah, that's one way. I guess you can't get a mistrial. I guess you're thinking fail to get ethics approval if they never change their mind. So I guess. But yeah, it's more like you have to get a consensus of all the members of research ethics. Yeah, please.
It sounds very similar to any type of advisory committee you'd be on. So even if you had one person, because unfortunately advisory committees are also volunteer based.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have one person a part of a minority group who says this would harm my community, it's considered issuing a block.
Yeah.
And then you have to decide whether or not you can get around harming their community, and if they decide absolutely not, the whole thing has to be thrown out.
Yeah, and you would have to shut it down. Usually they'll give you 2-3 chances to modify your project, and then if you can't get it passed, then it'd be like, okay, you have to kind of go back and building metaphor down to studs and redo it.
Entire community and the ethics based on your community can come down to one person. Is the big part is you then if I'm a trans person in a big group of other queer people and I'm representative of trans people, and they're deciding to do something and go forward with something that would hurt my community, I might be the only one with that perspective to say that. And I could be also making that call a little bit too early, or I couldn't make that call because I'm surrounded by a bunch of cis people, so I don't, like, I'm kind of pressured into it. There's a lot of issues with that, but yeah, you can issue a block.
Yeah, and yeah, one vote on the ethics committee can shut the whole thing down, right? So, and I mean, that's probably for the best, honestly, because, you know, if one person has serious questions and you can't answer them as the researcher, then there's obviously something potentially wrong, right? So it should be, at least you should have to go back and think about it and try to justify your position and kind of bring that person on side, right? And they can be minor issues, right? Like I'm getting way ahead of myself here. That's okay, whatever. When I was doing kind of studies of Russian TV, right? So I was going to be interviewing a bunch of TV executives in Russia and in Europe. And, you know, one of the person from nursing was like, this is different from how we do it in nursing, so could you explain this to me? It was like, well, how are you going to stop from, you know, the people you're asking from feeling coerced into talking to you as interviews? And I'm like, well, I was like, they're high-powered executives, right? And I am a lowly graduate student from a place they've never heard of. So, and I'll put it exactly as I think I put it at the time. If they don't want to talk to me, they're just going to tell me to fuck off, right? Which I was told on numerous occasions, which is fine. Is basically, right, if they don't want to talk to you, they're high-powered, you're low-powered, there's not a power dynamic. But obviously in some cases, right, if, say, a doctor was doing research on patients can feel pressured to talk to the doctor, and there has to be a way to mitigate those power dynamics, right? Because, you know, in my case, I had no power. They had all the power. But in a lot of cases, researchers are seen to be in very powerful positions. So that question could be like, well, how are you going to make people feel like they can say no to you, right? We'll talk about remuneration as well, which is an important one. Sometimes, like, if you're giving people incentives to participate in research, that can also leave them in a position where they feel like they can't say no. And there's a lot of calculus that goes into things like how much money could you give someone to participate in your research before it's viewed as coercive. And I mean, I was sitting in on a panel discussion where one of the criminologists here was arguing with someone at Queen's over $10. It was literally like, one person said $25, one person said $35. They wanted to give $35, and the one person was like, no, if you're doing research on, you know, unhoused populations, $35 is too much money. $25 is like the max, right? Because $35, you know, could be like 3 days worth of meals or whatever, right? But there's also these very fine details. And so, like, well, what if it was 30? No, that's still too much. What if it was 28? No, that's still too much, right? Like, it's quite fine details. But anyway, we'll get to that, and there's all sorts of things we can talk about. Okay. Sorry. Your questions are very good. Just keep asking. I'm happy to answer them. A little bit. It has gotten me out of order if I seem a little discombobulated. But they're very good questions. Okay. So, knowledge is of secondary importance, right? To the safety of participants. And this is to get around the idea that sometimes, you know, researchers will get in their head, right? As human beings who care deeply about the research that they're doing, sometimes researchers will be like, okay, yes, there's a chance that this might harm people, but think of the benefit of learning this thing. Like, you know, we'll know so much more about syphilis after we let these people be infected with syphilis for 30 years, right? Or it could be anything, right? But the knowledge you're going to gain from the perspective of ethics is always secondary to the safety of the participants, right? And it can never be the other way. So yeah, now, like I said, anytime you're dealing with human subjects, risk assessment, and you'll see, oh, my pen no worky. Sadness abounds. All right, you were working earlier. I'll just keep drawing and see if it works eventually. Okay, risk assessment, right? And you'll see it because one of the things you're going to have to do for your second mini lab is to do an information and consent letter. And one of the parts of the information and consent letter is a section where you outline the risks, right, to the person. Now, there might be no risks, right? There's a really good chance that there are no risks to the research you are hoping to do. And in that case, like with survey research, generally survey research, because people can quit anytime they want, you can say that there's no risk. Sometimes depending on the topic, right? If, I don't know, if you're doing a victimization survey talking about, sexual assault, you might have to have a section in, warning people before they do your survey that, hey, we'll be asking questions about sexual assault. And if you've been a victim of sexual assault, you could end up being re-traumatized by some of the questions. And then people are allowed to make the decision, right? But risk assessment is a key feature of all research that involves human beings. And yeah, you have to be constantly kind of balancing between what you want to know, the potential gains, and the risk of harm to your participants. And, basically, all of the major research institutions or funding agencies in Canada, what's called the Tri-Council, so that's SSHRC, CIHR, and NSERC, all, I don't know if it's pronounced CIHR, doesn't roll off the tongue like SSHRC or NSERC. So CIHR, Canadian Institute of Health Research, all have, basically they follow the Tri-Council policy statement on ethical conduct involving research, or for research involving humans, right, which you can find online, written in 2014, so about 10 years ago. And yeah, basically administered, so SSHRC and CIHR and NSERC funding is all administered through research ethics boards, typically at the university level, right? So if I'm a researcher applying to SSHRC to do research on human beings, right, and I get funding, I have to clear research ethics at my university, right? And let's say, like the team that I'm working with now, we have people at, U of A, we have people in Montreal, we have people in Toronto, we have people all over the country. Each person doing it at different institutions has to get research ethics approval at their individual institutions, right? So the approval process can be long. It doesn't always have to be. Given how big my boss's research project is, I assumed that her research ethics process would be really long, and she got her approval in a week, right? And I've seen people where it drags, where it goes for a month and a half. If for some reason you really have need, you can get the process expedited where they meet sooner. Sometimes the committee members can't meet because of conflicting schedules, and that can slow things down a lot of the time as well. So yeah, it can take long, but I've seen it take as much as like 2 months and as short as like a week. So it really depends on the research. Right. So the policy obviously is caused by, a history of experiments and research that did harm to participants, right? Tuskegee is the most common one, like the most egregious one, but even things like, the famous Stanford prison experiment, some of the psychological experiments where people thought they were harming others even though they weren't. Oh no, the projector's about to shut down. Haha, I caught it just in time. Otherwise, it's like a 2-minute cool down and a 1-minute warm up, but I caught it just in time. But yeah, because these, there has been academic research in the past that harmed people. Now we're subject to this safety check, right? This safety valve that everybody needs to clear, right? And I mean, part of it is a recognition that you as the researcher, sometimes we get tunnel vision, right? You get tunnel vision because you're so focused on the thing that you want, the outcome, right? The knowledge that you want to gain, that you might not ultimately recognize where the harms might come from. So it's good to have, a second, third, fourth, fifth set of eyes on your research to make sure that you have thought of everything, right? That you have mitigated the risk as much as possible. And yeah, I mean, over time, if anything, the requirements of research ethics boards have gotten more and more strict, right? Even people have been doing research for a decade or 2 decades, will suggest that a lot of things that might have been permitted 2 decades ago now increasingly have been cracked down on by research ethics boards, right? They're much less open to anything that they see as potential harms than they were in the past. So, the requirements tend to get more and more stringent over time. And as we think about like harms to different communities, different individuals in different ways, right? Those things all get taken into account. Yeah, please.
So prior to this, I was going to talk about experiments like the Stanford prison experiment and the syphilis one, but was there just no ethics board at all?
Yeah, so if you're looking at Tuskegee, there was no external ethical control when that one was conducted. It was basically assumed that researchers would do the right thing. I know that's foolish and it sounds dumb in retrospect, but I guess it's not until people saw like really genuine harms being done that they were like, oh, researchers can be bad people too, right? So yeah, I mean, research ethics boards, the first ones in the US, were honestly founded mostly in response to like the Tuskegee experiments. And it started in medicine, and then it was like, we need to expand this like across everything, right? But it's kind of a dawning awareness that, especially as academics has reached into more and more parts of human life, that we need to, really make sure we're not harming people, right? Why do I always get the construction rooms? Why? Every term I have one room where they're doing active construction outside the room the entire semester. Okay, yeah, John.
Speaking of researchers and ethics committee, what about the Henrietta Salt or situation? Was there a ethics committee for when that happened, or?
Oh, I'm not familiar with the case.
You know about Henrietta Lab?
It's not ringing a bell. Could you remind me? I might have heard of it and just not connecting it.
This woman who had her cells taken, Henrietta Lab.
Oh, you're talking about the cancer one. Is that the cancer one?
I'm not sure. She had her cells taken and then was it cancer?
Yeah, she had her cells taken from her cervix.
Yeah, and her cells kept growing, and they never told her they use it to expand medicine, and then they never told her, they never gave her.
She never gave her consent that her genetic material,
and they're still using it to this day, and her family's fighting for
control of it.
not control, but also partly control, also partially the profits, because they made billions.
They recently had a ruling on it.
Oh.
When she visited Johns Hopkins Hospital, her descendants have finally reached a settlement with a biotech company, but they accused her profiting from the settlement. So they settled outside of court.
Okay. Yeah.
Which means they're guilty.
The pharmaceutical company has enough money to be like, how much is it gonna cost to make this go away? Yeah. I actually don't know, because I remember the case, but I actually don't know if there was research ethics on it. It was if I'm not mistaken, they took the stem line in the 60s or 70s. So I would suspect there wasn't, right? Given the timeline, it's before the establishment of research ethics boards as a major component of research. So probably it was just like, oh, we took a biopsy and these cells just keep growing, so off we go. And yeah. Sorry.
So when was the ethics board started to be established?
Different places, different times, right? But kind of mid 1970s, early 1980s, depending again which time, which field. Which don't worry, it's not. I will not test you on that, but yeah, it's. I mean, that's relatively late. You would think.
Yeah,
Yeah.
That's why you hear about all those crazy experiments happening, psychology especially.
In the 60s, right? They're like, we're going to electrocute you till you cry. Try not to cry. Right. Yeah, psychologists, right? They're weird. They hate people. I just like to make fun of psychology. It's only because my experiences with it have generally been pretty bad. Psych 104 was a bit traumatic for me. Anyway, not because they made me listen to music and do math problems, though that could be traumatic for other reasons. Okay, so what was I saying? Yeah, so all Canadian research requires ethics board approval, and obviously, right, it can go as far as if you did it without research ethics board approval, someone should catch it, but you could lose, a tenure track position. This is the seriousness of the violation. So you absolutely have to have it. As part of SSHRC funding, in kind of midterm reports, you have to prove that you had ethics approval if it was part of the project. And yeah, I mean, I don't know. Oh, please work. No. All right. I'm putting my pen down. You can't begin your research, as I said, until you've obtained full ethics clearance approval from your institution. And yeah, so it can be approved which is, not the most common on the first try. Require modification, which I would say almost every time, you're going to get, some kind of requirement of modifications or reject a study, right? And again, hopefully most academics now are pretty attuned. So outright rejection is pretty uncommon. Most times it'll be require modification, and if you can't modify it to a degree that satisfies the research ethics boards within a couple of attempts, then they will probably reject it. And yeah, there's an appeals process for rejected studies, right? So that basically, if you think and sometimes, right, it could go down to you don't think the person or the people who were looking at your project really understood what the project was about, right? So you think, you're getting the sense from their comments that maybe, they're not 100% clear on how this project works or why it's ethical. In very rare cases, if you suspect that, and this is, I've heard of this happening, not firsthand, that somehow or other in this blind process, someone who really doesn't like you got on the research ethics board, right? And I remember hearing about this. It was like different departments, someone from, I think, poli-sci and from history, different disciplines, and whoever it was doing the review, they knew each other and they really didn't like each other. And so as a sort of petty vengeance thing, they shot down someone's research. And to avoid situations like that, there's also an appeals process if you think it was judged unfairly, right? And, it would be like if some of their objections didn't make sense, right? And there was no way to reach the ethical standard that they're kind of suggesting you have to meet, you can then get a new research ethics board formed and get different sets of eyes on it, just to make sure that, again, there's not shenanigans, because you don't know who your reviewers are, but they know who you are, right? It's a blind process on your side, not on theirs. Okay. So, basically, universities, colleges, government, private companies typically have research ethics boards of some kind that they are responsible to. Private industry is a little bit more dicey. It depends on the kind of private companies. Certainly, pharmaceutical companies definitely have research ethics boards that they're responsible to. They're often internal, right? That they control, or a group of pharmaceutical companies have an ethics board so that they, kind of control them. In other cases, right, I've seen polling companies and social research companies that don't really have research ethics built in at all. So there's some questions there. It's not everybody that does human research that has a research ethics boards, but generally, universities, colleges, government, 100% do. And like I said before, they are generally made up of people from different disciplines, people who aren't necessarily experts in the field that you're studying. And you always have to have some kind of external representative. Often, at the university level, they're looking for community stakeholders, someone who's potentially a non-academic, who might, a member of a community, who would be willing to kind of sit on an ethics board to give that non-academic set of eyes, at least, someone who's from a discipline, that's 2 steps removed from the one that you're talking about, or that you're coming from, so that they're not influenced maybe by the biases of your particular discipline. And there are conflict of interest rules, which most of the time do, remove most of the problems. So things like, funding relationships, even if you're potentially, let's say, funded by the same group, right? Let's say, like in pharmaceuticals, if you were both being funded by Pfizer, you couldn't serve on the research ethics board for someone else being funded by Pfizer, because then what if Pfizer's whispering in your ear, we just need you to approve Dr. Smith's research, right? You can't have that. So there are, funding relationships. And if you've worked with the applicant, right, you're not supposed, so if you've collaborated, and there's very specific rules. So if you've co-authored a publication with them, if you've been on something like a PhD committee with them, and there's a couple of other ones I can't remember. Oh, if you've served on the board, on the editorial board of the same journal at the same time, you're not supposed to review each other's work, right? Because there's that potential for some kind of conflict of interest. And there's all sorts of rules. And like I said, it's all listed in the Tri-Council ethics policy. Technically, you're not supposed to, anyone you've had conflicts with, you're not supposed to review their work either. Though, like I said, sometimes people don't follow the rules, and that's why there's an appeals process as well. So, yeah, but if you've co-authored anything with an applicant, you are 100% not eligible to review their work. Huge conflict of interest. Friendships, right? Being friends with someone, you should disclose that, and they would probably take you off. It wouldn't be 100% for sure that you'd be taken off, but you should be, right? Okay. So, generally speaking, when we talk about, was your hand up or?
No.
Okay, sorry. Okay. Sometimes I see motion in my peripheral vision and I'm not sure if I switch slides and then you got discouraged and put your hand down. I made you sad. All right, ethics. Yeah, ethics approval for quantitative work tends to be a lot easier, right? And partially because, especially when you're doing quantitative research, like surveys is our big quantitative tool. So when you're doing quantitative surveys, because there's a pretty big distance between the researcher and the participant, and because the chances of say traumatizing someone are relatively low, right? If you're just asking survey questions, you'd have to write a pretty exceptional survey question to re-traumatize someone. Can happen. You need to think about the risks, but it does tend to be more rare. And the bar for someone to, like the relationship between the researcher and the participant is typically pretty distant. So like if someone, was doing your survey and they were offended by the line of questioning you were asking, they felt it was harming them, what do most people do? They quit the survey, right? And then their data doesn't get included. Because quantitative work is usually at that remove, it's typically pretty easy to get by research ethics boards, because as long as you're, and I've done this kind of research, as long as you say that, participants will be free to exit the survey at any time, and any uncompleted surveys will not be included in the finished data set, basically then people have the right to remove their data and they have the right to stop at any time. And that's a big part of making sure that they're not being harmed, right? So yeah, generally on your application, right, you're going to state your hypothesis, your specific plan for testing. I mean, that's not even always, because when I was doing my quantitative work, I was doing it sort of without a hypothesis. I just basically said what I was going to do. I was going to do 2 surveys of people in the Edmonton area to find out this. And that was good. And, with all those caveats, right, they can quit anytime. If they quit, their data is not included. And I'm not collecting any personal data, right? So I'm not collecting any identifying data at all. And that one got through Research Ethics Board in about 6 days, right? So that one was pretty easy. Qualitative can be a little bit harder, right? Some research ethics boards favor quantitative work because it's considered more scientific, right? Especially if you have a bunch of kind of natural science people on the research ethics board. There are moments where they don't really get qualitative work, right? Or they think it's too subjective, and they can be a little bit harder on it. So that's something to keep in mind. Qualitative work is tricky, right? Because you're often interacting with people on a one-to-one basis. And there's a bunch of things that tend to go with that, right? It's harder for people when they're looking you in the face, right? And they're sitting in a room with you, often to quit because they feel a kind of social pressure. You being, from a research institution, often there's going to be a power dynamic there that you might not even be aware of. And my boss is really smart about this. Like, when they do research with vulnerable populations, she makes sure all of the researchers are dressed down, right? So no suits, she doesn't even want button-up shirts with collars. It's like no hoods either, but that's a different reason. Sweatshirts, jeans, looking so that you're not projecting a sort of social power with your clothing, right? You're not showing up in your Armani suit. There's also, she doesn't want, this is a different question, she doesn't want the female researchers trying to flirt with participants to get them to open up. But that's a totally different thing, because that taints the research in other ways. So it's like dress plain, very boring, No logos, like no U of A logo on the clothes. Very specific rules, specifically for that. Yeah, so qualitative work can be harder to quit. It's also much more personal, right? Because you're in direct contact with the research participant in a lot of cases, right? If you're doing ethnography, you're in pretty direct contact with people. And if you're doing interviews, again, you're talking one-on-one with people, and that can, there's different kinds of risks, right? There's different kinds of problems, and that more personal relationship can make it a lot harder for people to quit. It's much more typical too, and I will talk about, reimbursement and all that qualitative work, in order to get people to participate, has some kind of remuneration, right? Like now we've moved to bank transfers and gift cards as pretty typical ways of getting people to participate, Visa gift cards or whatever it happens to be. Again, there's these sort of problems with, if you're paying people to be part of the research or compensating them for their time, how much is too much? What's reasonable? At what point do you cross that barrier into it being too much for them to legitimately say no? Okay. Does that all make sense? I know. It's the most exciting. Yeah, so we talk about qualitative work. One of the things that sometimes happens with qualitative work, right? Because you're interacting with people in these more personal ways, right? It's sometimes harder to anticipate what you're actually going to find, right? So you go in with one idea of, say, you're doing an ethnography, and you think what you're going to find is this, right? You think you're going to find, I don't know, that furries are dominated by men who who are having trouble growing up, right? They've got a sort of Peter Pan complex. I'm just making something up completely randomly, right? So you have this kind of theory, but as you go and interact with them, right, you go to Edmonton Furry Con and all of that stuff, you basically end up discovering new themes. So it can be hard to have come up with your hypothesis for what you're going to find beforehand and how you're going to test it, right? So in some cases, right, research ethics boards are going to be attuned to that. You may discover things you're not sure. And what are you going to do if you run into this? What if you run into, in the community you're looking at, sexual trauma, right? Well, what are you going to do then? Because there's a little bit more variance in terms of what people might start to talk to you about. And honestly, having listened to, interviews that other researchers have done for the purpose of transcription, sometimes, you're starting on one thing and the person you're talking to veers into completely left field. You weren't expecting it. And suddenly you have all this data on, and I was listening to one that one of our researchers did a few years ago, and the person is crying, totally a very innocuous question. And they kind of started answering about their whole history of sexual trauma, right? And it was okay, now you veered into something you didn't expect. So the Research Ethics Board may want you to take that into account. Excuse me. The fact that you're probably going to capture data on people that would not want their activities observed. In ethnography, this can be very true, right? So if you're doing a participant observation of some kind in a group, right, they may be aware that you're there, but you may be observing things that other people might not want you to see. And there's lots of weird examples. I think it was you that brought up the observing men, using urinals, and how they behave at urinals, right? There could be, there might be some things that happen in washrooms that people might not want observed, right? And there's been weird studies about public washrooms. It's kind of odd. There was one it was in California, and again, it was in the 70s. It was observing the activities of gay men in public washrooms at California rest stops. And I think no, it was honestly someone just hung out in the bathroom observing what was happening. And I think by today's standards, that would be unethical, but at the time, no ethics. So you do what you want, right? But yeah, that might be things that these people didn't want observed, right? That they thought that it wouldn't be observed, especially if you're in public, right? Do people have a reasonable expectation of privacy, in the things that they're doing? Is it fair for them to think that they're being observed? And what's the boundary between a private a semi-private, and a private space, that's all things that you might have to take into account with qualitative research. Are you giving people fair warning, say in interviews, that they can say things off the record, right? That they don't want said on the record, right? Are you making sure that you tell them when recordings are beginning so that they know, maybe they just think you're bantering prior to an interview beginning. These are all things that research ethics is going to want you to sort of think about, right? How are you protecting their privacy? Do they have control over the data? Is there some, time period? I think that's on another slide where they can withdraw their data, right? All these sorts of things, right? And yeah, so a cautious research board, can restrict the research project or say you can do this part, but you can't do this part. Prevent funding or prevent the research project. Again, mostly it's pretty atypical that they're going to shoot your whole research project, like Bambi's mom. But, they can modify it in significant ways. And, this can lead to some resentment on the part of researchers. Okay. So, so the Tri-Council policy for research ethics basically, provides for variations in research methods. Again, it's a pretty broad policy in the sense that, it covers medicine in CIHR, engineering and science through NSERC, and then the social sciences and humanities through SHRC. So it has to be pretty broad and open to a lot of different kind of research methodologies. But 3 basic principles: respect for the person, concern for welfare, and justice, right? So, yeah, the concern for justice. All of these things are supposed to be part of everyone's thinking when it comes to ethics. Right, so what does respect for the person kind of entail, right? So basically, one of the big things, and again, it can be really easy for researchers who are interested in a particular question and think that their research is so important, right? And we all get that. We get this tunnel vision, right? Especially grad students. I remember being a grad student, and it was like, my project is it was not the most important thing ever. But you get this sense like, my research is going to change the world. It did not change the world, and rarely does. But people get this kind of tunnel vision. And so you can start treating, subjects as objects, right? Or resources to be used to an end, which the end is usually, your research, right? And again, this is Tuskegee, right? It was like these African-American males were used as to further an end of knowing more about syphilis, not as human beings, right? So they're dehumanized or objectified, and we don't want that. Individuals have basic human rights that include dignified treatment by researchers, and this is the most fundamental, right? You can't do things that dehumanize your subjects, right? That's a huge ethical violation. Is that a question, or just supporting your head, trying to keep you from falling asleep? I gotcha. And so key to this is informed consent, right? And informed consent is a little tricky at times because it has to be free, and so it has to be front-loaded, right? So people have to agree at the beginning, but you also have to give people a sense in doing research that they have an ongoing ability, within reason, of course, to exit participation, right? To withdraw their consent, right? So yeah, and the idea is that we should all be collaborators in the research, right? We're trying to learn things and they're trying to help us, rather than I'm using them to get my information. So very clearly, when you are beginning the research, right? Now you can do that. Typically this is done in your information and consent letter, which again, you'll be doing as part of that second mini lab. But basically, people have to be advised of the potential risks and potential benefits of a study at the beginning. So potential risks, like what, if any, risks are there, right? Might you use their information in such a way as it might identify them, right? Might you traumatize them in some way? Might you be talking about themes? Would you actually physically be putting them in danger, right, in some way? And this is pretty rare that you'd actually be putting people in legitimate danger, but it could, in theory, happen, and you have to think that through. So I'll give you an example. When I was doing my research on Russian TV, one of the questions that was sort of asked by the research board is, given that I'm Russia's a somewhat repressive state where journalists have been murdered by the government, would I be putting any of the people that I was interviewing in danger of some kind of government reprisal if they told me something that the government didn't like? And I had to kind of think about that, and I'm like, I don't think so. And given that they're executives or high ranking, they can just choose not to talk to me if they think that's a risk to them. Now, that said, I mean, one of the people I interviewed, he only emailed me through an anonymous Google account where it was like 7476777@gmail.com. And we had to use a very specific chat service that he told me to use that apparently was untraceable or something. And that was, for his protection. But it was this kind of question of, I mean, we talked about TV show, like Russian sitcoms. So maybe that was a little bit too much security, but that was his choice, right? But that was a question the research board asked me, is like, could this person face reprisals if someone found out that they talked to you, right? And I didn't think that was a realistic possibility, since again, we're talking about sitcoms and fiction TV, and not, whether Putin's a nice guy or not, or anything like that. So, but that's the kind of thing that, the research ethics board was like, hey, have you thought of this? And I had said, no, but this is my answer to your question. I don't think it's an issue for the following reason. So yeah, I mean, you had to put on the information and consent letter. Yeah, I had to put the risks, right? Like maybe, you might want to think about this, that if someone finds out, you might face reprisals. So it's on my consent letter for that participant. Potential participants have to be given, an information sheet or consent form outlining what the research is about, who you are, right? So it has to have a bunch of things, like who you are, what the project is, what you're trying to find out, what the methodology is going to be, right? Are there any risks? Are there any benefits, right? So if you're, if you're going to pay people a $25 gift card, or, something like a chance to win, a ballot where they have a chance of winning $100 or something like that, that has to be outlined on the information and consent sheet, right? So if you're going to pay them gift cards, you have to say, you will be provided with, a $25 gift card for your participation. I ran into a problem with this, actually, where I had to actually fix something and go back to research ethics because I was using a service called Abacus Data to do my polling. What I didn't know when I made my research ethics board application was that Abacus Data, as people who belong to their online panels, provides them with points, right? For if you fill out a survey through their web portal, you get 5 points per survey. That wasn't coming directly from me, but when I found out about it, I talked to my boss, and I was like, okay, do I have to go back to research ethics and say, because I'm not providing them with any incentive for doing it, and it was like, we better just go and check that research ethics is okay with this. And it was like, okay, Abacus, I'm not providing any benefit, but you might be provided, points towards your Abacus Data account based on your participation, coming directly from them and not from me. So you might get a form of remuneration from them, right? We had to think about that. Ethics was fine with it. They're like, you don't control that, and that's kind of part of the environment of web surveys today. But it was still something where I was like, should I just lie about this? And my boss was like, don't lie about stuff, it's bad. Or just ignore that it's a possibility. And we had to go back and just, basically I submitted an amendment to the research ethics board, and they're like, no, it's fine. Anything, right, you find out there's a third party offering benefits on your study, it's something you gotta clear too, because you have to tell people this in advance, right? Even though they clearly know. So, yeah, so the information sheet, and you can use, this obviously is in the textbook, and I've got it on the slide here. You can use this as your template. I also have provided you a different template for one of them that I've done for one of my studies. So feel free to use either one. But basically, this is mine is a little bit more clearly outlined in that I have sections, right? And I have section headers, which I like because it makes sure that I know exactly who, that everything is outlined in a very clear way. Right, so what does it outline? The project, right? The methods. How are you getting the research? Are you doing interviews, right? Are you doing a survey? Are you doing participant observation? Are you doing whatever you're doing, right? A lab experiment. What is the methodology? Potential benefits and risks, um, the names of those in charge. So as the researcher, right, you're going to be given your name. If you're a grad student, right, you also have to provide your supervisor's name, so that if there's any problem with what you're doing, they could contact not just their name, but their contact information as well. They could contact your supervisor and be like, hey, I think your student is off in left field and doing some unethical stuff, right? The supervisor is actually responsible for the grad student in that way. And you can both be sanctioned if something goes awry. So supervisor's name has to be there. They're technically in charge of you. You're in charge of the research. Both names have to be there. The affiliated institution and contact information, and typically, right, something like the office of your contact information, but also the contact information of the Office for Research Ethics, so that if they feel like something was amiss, they can make an anonymous complaint about your research. You typically also provide them with your research ethics code, your PRO number, right? At university, they all start with PRO. So you provide that so they know what project to reference, so they can find you really, really easily, and all of that stuff. Assurances of confidentiality, including often, I'm just thinking how to say this. You can give people the option of how they want to be identified, right? So like if you're interviewing people and, people can choose a pseudonym. I had lots of people, right, who only wanted to be identified not by name, but by title, right? So job title. I interviewed like executives as like a Russian TV executive, and that's how they wanted to be identified, or a international format consultant. That's all they wanted. Now, anybody with 2 licks of sense who knew anything about the context would have been able to figure out who they were in about 8 seconds, but they still had the right on how they were going to be identified, right? How the data will be stored, which I've been told comfortably or uncomfortably, is the section where most of us violate our ethics pretty grossly. So typically, the way this has always been phrased in the research letters that I've seen, and to be honest, I don't think anybody actually does it, is like, I will keep this information on a separate hard drive, like an external drive, which I will keep in my locked office in a cabinet guarded by a 3-headed dog named Cerberus, right? Or something like that. And the data will be kept for a period of 5 years, after which point it will be destroyed. That used to be the norm, and now the Research Ethics Board have been like, well, digital information is different, so it's not like you're holding on to papers. So it's like, it will be stored in perpetuity. And that seems to be okay with research ethics now. But yeah, basically, how the data will be stored. And usually they wanted it with some kind of sense of like, where is it stored? Like, is it kept separate from your other files? And all that stuff. My last one, I said I was going to store it on my personal OneDrive account, and they also didn't care. So that seemed to slip by okay. I don't know about that. So how the data is going to be stored, and like I said, I think there's an understanding that most people have said, I'm going to store it on a separate hard drive in a locked cabinet on the 27th floor of a tower guarded by a dragon. And then most people just keep it on their laptop hard drive, and that doesn't actually happen, or on a shared Google Drive that's part of the university. Apparently, though, European researchers have told me this, that in Europe, with the research ethics boards, cloud storage, especially by Google, is not allowed, right? A lot of their universities actually maintain like internal cloud storage systems that are run by their universities, because there's the assumption that like Google and Microsoft are not and Dropbox are not especially trustworthy, and that they may be kind of accessing your data at will, or government may have the ability to access that data at will. So if you ever go do research in Europe, they are much tighter on data security standards than we are here. Because we had a researcher in from Denmark last year, and he was like, he was looking at my boss's thing. He was like, oh yeah, we're going to store it on our Google Drive that the university provides. And he was like, yeah, that would never pass back home. He's like, no way. They would be like, are you kidding? You want your data stolen? So there you go. Different standards in different places, right? And then what you're gonna do with the findings, how they're gonna be published, right? And this is usually, I'm gonna use it for a book or a journal articles or whatever it happens to be. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, so this was one of mine. Consent form, right? It's important because it mentions the ability for the participant to leave the study at any time, right? Now, again, in a quantitative one, typically this is, the person can leave. If you're doing like an ethnography, they can leave that context. If you're doing a survey, they can quit, and then their data doesn't get included. In qualitative, like if you're doing interviews, a person, can choose to end you have to say, you can choose to end the interview at any time, right? You're not bound to finish it. You're free to leave at any time with no explanation given, all of that sort of stuff, right? Typically, I always merge my stuff into one document. I never have a separate, I always have like the information and consent letter, and you can see I have headers because good times. So, I guess a couple of other things that I think I don't know if I have it on the next slide. I forget. Okay, yeah, I'll just tell you. When it comes to like control of the data, generally you can give people a kind of limited right to remove their data from the study, even if you're doing like a qualitative study with interviews, right? So you could say, you can give a window of time, right? So you can choose to remove your data from the study within 2 weeks, right? So if you decide, that you said something in your interview that you don't want included in the project, you can either have that comment removed, or you can be like, I actually now feel uncomfortable with this whole project. Could you delete my whole interview? And that should be, theoretically in your, if you're interviewing people, especially, they should have the right to remove their data for a limited period of time, right? You don't have to give it forever, right? You don't have to be like, you can remove your data from the study for the next 15 years. That's obviously not reasonable on your end. But if you give people a reasonable window, I've seen 7 days, I've seen 2 weeks, I've seen a month, just the right to remove their data if they decide they in retrospect, this is where the ongoing consent, in retrospect, they didn't want to participate. But obviously, right, if you've published articles in the journal 2 years later, they shouldn't have the ability to be like, actually, I need you to unpublish that article, right? Because there's bounds on everything. Okay. So prospective participants must have the ability to understand, right? If you're dealing with someone with kind of mental limitations, whether, people with disabilities or children, they have to have the ability to actually consent. Otherwise, an agent, a guardian or a guardian has to consent. Minors of any kind, right? Whether they're, 1 day before their 18th birthday or 5 years old, you have to get consent from a parent or guardian, right? Like I said, it could be they're turning 18 tomorrow and you're doing the interview today. They still can't legally consent to research, right? They can legally consent to some other things, but research, they would still have to have a guardian sign off on it. Just, to dot all your I's and cross all your T's. I almost said that backwards. Cross all your I's and dot all your T's, which would have been wrong. But that's the part of the day we're at. So, so consent, they have to be able to consent. And if not, is there someone who can consent for them legally, right? Like it has to be a legal representative. Their healthcare provider can't consent for them. It has to be their legal provider. Okay. In terms of, informed consent, it can be difficult, to imagine all of the possibilities, or to give prospective participants all the information to make fully informed decisions, right? But, in ethnography, sometimes, especially if you're doing things that are kind of covert or semi-covert, right, it can be really difficult to, prevent reactivity if you're doing, information and consent letters. Now, this is something obviously that has to be run through research ethics as well. If you're going to be doing, say, some kind of covert research, that has to be approved by the Research Ethics Board. And sometimes you might be able to get away with not getting informed consent. Again, these cases are rarer and rarer because research ethics boards are much more strict than they used to be on any kind of covert research. But, in it can be really hard in ethnography to get informed consent, especially in public settings, because you're not always even in contact with all of the participants and all the people who might be included in your research. So some of the things that make it challenging, right? Contamination of subjects. If people know you're there, it can contaminate the research, right? People aren't acting naturally anymore. Reactivity, unforeseen changes due to emergent themes, right? You might have not been looking for something, so could you give informed consent if you didn't know what you were looking for? And a lot of times, especially with like what we call a grounded theory approach, right? You didn't start with a specific hypothesis. You just gather data and then kind of figure out the themes as you go along. So this can be a major challenge as well. Yeah, you might not, especially if you're in a public or semi-public setting, you can have unknown people entering and exiting the space. They might get caught up in your data collection, but you don't have the ability to provide them with consent. Experiments, experiments are particularly problematic for fully informed consent, because if they know what you're looking for, right, then a lot of times participants will actively try to give you what you're looking for, right? Or they could try to derail your project if they're jerks, but mostly people will be like, oh, I know that they're looking for me to act in this particular way, or to see if I will act in this way, so that's what I'm going to do, because it'll help their research, right? People are helpful like that. Sometimes, right, you can have some degree of deception, but like I said, a lot of research ethics boards are really, really cool on deception because they see it as very, very problematic, right? As potentially reducing people's ability to give informed consent. So it has to be clearly justified, right? If you're doing deception-based research, again, it's possible, right? But you'd have to make a case to the research ethics board that the reactive effects that you would get from informed consent at the beginning would basically invalidate the whole research, and that by being deceptive, you're not actually going to cause people harm, right? So I can't even think of an example of this at this point, but you'd have to make the case that the risks of harm are minimal, but the risks of reactivity of people knowing that I'm there and what I'm doing are so that it would make the whole thing invalid, right? And then, debriefing is important. Mostly, after whatever has been concluded, telling people what you were doing, and often giving them the ability to, if they feel that the deception has somehow violated, their dignity, the ability to remove their data from the experiment or from the data set, right? So debriefing, again, typically after you've gathered your data, and this is mostly only, in experimental settings, right? Where you have a very controlled environment. And it's like, okay, now that you've done the experiment, here's what we were really looking for. In retrospect, are you okay with that? Is it okay if we use your data? That can kind of mitigate things as well. I know, research ethics, so exciting. Sorry, I'm just I have 11 minutes. I just want to see where I am. 13 of 18. Oh, well, let's do a couple more, and then we can finish this on Wednesday easily. Okay, so concern for welfare, right, is the well-being of... Apparently there was a fire in the chemistry building today. I was told this after I had a class in there, and I was like, amazing. Everything is falling apart on campus. It's awesome. I suppose chemicals can burn, but I had students being like, do we have class today? There's a fire. I'm like, there's no alarm. We're here. If we all burn to death, it's my fault. Also, I'm closest to the door. So, welfare, right? Concern with the well-being of persons, groups, community affected by the research. Avoid harm, embarrassment, inadvertent identification. And again, giving people pseudonyms or the ability to use pseudonyms, or sometimes, identifying them by a code, right? So like the research that the CCR is doing right now, they're talking to incarcerated individuals, and we're not even like writing down their names, right? Basically, we have a code. It's like at this prison, so it's H, that prison code is H. This is interview 1, and the researcher was this person, right? So it's A2, for whichever researcher it was. So that we don't even, in any of the data we have, we won't even have their name written down to make sure that no matter what we write, no one will be able to identify them later on. Ensuring the right to privacy, a big deal, right? Especially vulnerable populations or populations that might not want to be identified. It's important. So at least asking people, do they want to be identified? How do they want to be identified? All of that stuff. And like I said, there's a bunch of different ways you could do this. You could identify them by a pseudonym. You could identify them by just a letter. You could identify them by the position they have, right? All of these sorts of things are all possibilities. And then confidentiality, have to be maintained when there's contact between the researcher and the subject. You can't disclose details that they don't want disclosed. And again, it can be really important to give people the options for, if they're telling you something that's really personal, it can be a good idea to just stop them and be like, hey, I just want to make sure, is this on the record or off the record, right? To give them that option. It can be super inconvenient because sometimes people are giving you just the best stuff, right? And they're telling you something that's really, really fascinating that you really want to include in the project. But, again, always thinking about the ethics, you should be like, okay, we've now crossed into a zone where what if they're uncomfortable with me reporting this? Well, is it okay if I keep this on the record or do you want this off the record, right? And it can suck because sometimes it's amazing. And other times, they just, but it's the right thing to do to let them make that choice. Okay. So sometimes pseudonyms might not be enough, right? So making sure people have privacy. Sometimes pseudonyms might not be enough. And I know that, in some of the research that's been done in prisons, because they're such small communities, right? Like if you tell someone that you were at, a Red Deer Remand Center, right? Red Deer Remand is tiny, right? It's a tiny, tiny little facility. And so based on like time and place and all of these things, someone might very well be able to identify who that was that told you something, right? If you were there in January, of 2024, doing interviews at Red Deer Remand, there's probably only like 200 people that are there. And if you give, a bunch of descriptive information, even about the crimes they committed, right? So you have to make sure that, even if you give the person a pseudonym or a code, that when you're kind of reporting things, you don't necessarily identify them in such a way as people could figure out who they are, right? And again, it can be a real pain to do it, but it's the right thing to do to maintain people's privacy, especially people for whom there might be, later ramifications, either fear of reprisal or, loss of employment or these sorts of things, right? You really, really don't want to cause people harm after the research is done either. In-depth research analysis reporting might provide enough details that people could be identified. So you need to make sure to change or code identifying information about participants in such a way as to properly anonymize them, assuming they want to be anonymized. Okay, so I'm losing my voice here. So another issue surrounding privacy. With covert research, and we'll talk about, especially when we talk about ethnography, covert research can be very useful, and there's been really, there's reasons to do it, although like I said, research ethics is getting dicey on covert research. The biggest one, when we talk about, worries about doing this kind of research is mostly this one, right? It's reactivity. That's the one that we're mostly concerned about as researchers, right? When you're a researcher, the last thing you want is for your presence to change the data. And so a lot of times when we're proposing covert research, we want, the reactivity to be as low as possible. But of course, right, these few points, oops, that was a bad job on my part. That covert research can be very intrusive in that if people don't know who you are and what you're doing, they may reveal things that, if they think you're friends, right? You're going to, FurryCon in Edmonton, and they think you're just a fellow furry, right? Because you're wearing a furry suit and you're talking to them about all sorts of details of their personal life. They might think that you're a friend, and you might find out things that they wouldn't tell a researcher otherwise, right? They can't consent because you're not telling them who they are. There's no reactivity, but it's very intrusive, right? And you're potentially violating their rights to privacy and to control who they talk to and what about. So you'd have to make a case to the Research Ethics Board that the risks outweigh the benefits. Or sorry, that the risks outweigh the benefits. The benefits outweigh the risks. Not that the risks outweigh the benefits. That would be bad, and that would get you shut down right away. It's like incredibly risky. They're probably going to die, right? I'm interviewing these people that are part of a biker gang, or I'm hanging out with the Hells Angels, and they're going to tell me all about their crimes, and then I'm going to publish it, and then the RCMP is going to go pick them up, right? That would be like too much risk, not enough benefit, right? So, amazingly, people have done this kind of research where they go hang out with the Hells Angels, and it's cool research, but yeah. Also, the Hells Angels don't feel very good about it later. So you could put yourself at risk. That's also an important thing to think about. Yeah, sometimes you can, look for participant or permission to use data after the fact for consent, but this is fraught too, because you can actually, cause a lot of hurt feelings and bad emotions in people if they know they were deceived, right? So it can be really difficult as well. And yeah, I mean, non-consenting participants, you definitely can't identify them by name or in a way that people are going to know who they are, because you didn't get that permission from them. Okay, I will say this one last thing. I'll talk about duty to report. Actually, you know what? There's there's way too many interesting things to say about duty to report, because I have lots of thoughts, and I've heard lots of interesting stories from especially criminologists who interview, gang members and such. Let's pick it up here on Wednesday, and then we will jump into the next topic after we finish research ethics. Oh yeah, please, sorry.
Just to be clear, lab does not happen tomorrow, and the lab due Sunday is not due.
I will move it right away. Like, I'll go in right on E-class and move it to the Sunday after. I think in my initial setup I had a different plan, but yeah, it'll be due, like, not this Sunday, which is the 27th.
And then does that,
I'll bump that a week.
subsequent lab to the following week, or
I will make sure the dates are all correct for Wednesday, and then, but yeah, everything will be bumped. So it's the Sunday after the next lab. So like whenever you do the third lab, then the third mini lab will be due that Sunday, right? So not the Sunday before, but the Sunday after. So I mean, I can tell you, if I look at a calendar, I can tell you what dates they're. The one that's on E-class, at least for the first half, will be the one that we have, right? So not this week, but next week, and then not the week after, but I can't remember where reading week falls. I thought I had changed. I thought I had. Okay, I will make sure to change it, and I'll send out an email with the proper lab schedule, because I thought I had re-uploaded, but maybe I uploaded the wrong file, which happens sometimes. So I will double check, and I will make sure that it's all correct going forward. And I'll send out an email. I'll do it before I go home to tell people there's no lab tomorrow. All right. Okay. Hi.
I have a question. So I was wondering, like, you're kind of talking about like biker gangs and things like that. So if you do like a study, or you like where you don't tell them like there's no informed consent, after are you usually obligated to tell them that, oh, this actually